When Emily Hartwell boarded the small, rattling plane that September afternoon, no one could have imagined she would vanish before the jump was even over. The 29-year-old graphic designer had been smiling for the camera minutes earlier, joking with friends as the instructor clipped her harness. The skydive was meant to be a bucket list thrill before the summer ended. But when the group touched down on the grassy field outside town, Emily wasn't among them. Somewhere between the clouds and the ground, she had simply disappeared. And 8 months later, what a hunter stumbled upon deep in the woods would dismantle every explanation and uncover a truth stranger than anything the search teams had considered. The wind at 14,000 feet carried a sound unlike anything on the ground, a low, constant roar that pressed against the body and filled the ears until conversation was just shapes of mouths. Emily had her goggles already in place, the instructor's hand steadying her shoulder as the open hatch of the plane drew in the sky. The farmland below was a patchwork of muted greens and golds, stitched together by thin rivers glinting in the late afternoon light. She felt the tremor of anticipation rise from her chest to her fingertips. Her friends, Kara and Milo, were in the row behind, exchanging nervous grins with their own tandem instructors. This was Emily's second jump. The first had been a dare 3 years ago, a hazy memory of wind and adrenaline. This time, she said, she wanted to pay attention, to really see. She'd told them that in the hangar earlier, tugging her jumpsuit zipper to her collarbone and laughing as the wind sock outside snapped in the breeze. The instructor, Craig, had done hundreds of these. His voice in her ear was calm, practiced. "When we go, you don't think, you just step." He leaned forward to check the straps one more time. The air smelled faintly of fuel and cold metal. Then the light near the hatch changed from red to green. Emily followed the motion, hands on the door frame, and for a fraction of a second, she let her gaze roam to the horizon, to the thin veil of clouds, to the immense quiet waiting beneath the roar. Craig counted down with a tap on her shoulder, and they moved as one into the void. The first seconds of freefall erased thought. Her stomach lurched, her breath caught, and the world became a rushing tunnel of air and color. Craig's hand was still on her harness. The ground swelled slowly into definition, fields, barns, the speck of the landing zone. Kara would later say she saw Emily glance over her shoulder mid-fall, her mouth forming words the wind swallowed whole. Milo remembered Craig raising one hand, signaling something to another instructor. None of them noticed anything unusual beyond that. Not then. At 5,000 feet, the canopies bloomed one by one, bright nylon opening with a snap against the wind. Emily's parachute deployed. Witnesses swore they saw it. But somewhere in those last minutes of descent, she vanished from sight. When the others landed, the instructors moved quickly into a head count. Craig's face shifted from routine focus to something else, a sharp, searching look scanning the horizon. Kara unclipped her helmet, glancing upward to where Emily's chute should have been. They searched the drop zone, then the surrounding fields. Instructors jogged toward the tree line, radios crackling. Someone said maybe she drifted too far west. Someone else pointed at the patch of forest beyond the creek. By sunset, county deputies had arrived. A helicopter circled low, its spotlight brushing over cornfields and narrow roads. Volunteers in orange vests formed lines along the grass. They called her name until the dark made it impossible to see. Back at the hangar, Kara sat on a folding chair, her hair still wind-tangled, her jumpsuit unzipped halfway. She stared at the empty space where Emily's duffel bag sat on the bench. Inside it was her phone, her wallet, her car keys, all untouched. Craig gave his statement quietly, pausing often, as if replaying the jump in his mind. He was sure the chute opened. He was sure they were still in formation when she looked over her shoulder. After that, his memory was a blur, a shift in wind, a flicker of movement, and then nothing. Search teams combed the area for 4 days. They found no torn parachute caught in trees, no sign of impact in the fields, no tracks along the creek. By the end of the week, the official theory was drift, that she had been carried farther than they realized. But even that couldn't explain the absence of any gear, any trace. For months, Emily's family pushed for more. They posted flyers, spoke on local news, kept her name in rotation on missing person bulletins. Leads trickled in, a woman matching her description seen at a gas station 2 towns over, someone spotting a parachute-like shape snagged high in pines near the ridge. All were dead ends. It wasn't until the following spring, when snowmelt had softened the forest floor, that a hunter moving through the far edge of state land stumbled on something he couldn't explain, something that would draw investigators back to the case with a new, unsettling urgency. The news cycle treated it like an oddity for 3 days and then moved on. A woman who disappeared mid-jump, dramatic enough for a headline, but without a body or footage, the story thinned quickly. They called her an experienced thrill seeker, even though her only previous jumps had been tandem ones, always with an instructor strapped to her. They called it possible equipment malfunction, though the gear check before takeoff had been signed by 2 separate people, including Alex. And they called it unlikely survival, which sounded more like the ending of the matter than the beginning. Alex wasn't ready to let it go. He'd been on the ground when it happened, headset on, scanning the sky for the specks of the drop. He'd heard nothing but static, and then a brief burst of her voice, not panicked, not screaming, but clipped, as if she were talking to someone else entirely. That 3-second audio clip replayed in his head with unnatural clarity. You don't have to. Cut to static. In the following days, search crews scoured the drop zone and beyond. The grid expanded outward until they were combing ravines 20 miles from the airfield. Helicopters buzzed low over pine ridges, their rotors scattering leaves into brief cyclones. Alex joined in where he could, walking lines through tall grass, his boots catching on hidden wires of barbed fence that had long since been swallowed by the earth. Every evening ended the same way, wet clothes, aching legs, and nothing to show for it. The official line from the sheriff's department was that she'd gone down somewhere in the national forest. Possible that her chute had failed to deploy. Possible she'd been carried off course by a rogue crosswind. Alex knew better. He'd seen the chute open. He'd seen it blossom red and white against the pale blue afternoon, perfectly inflated, riding the air in clean arcs. What he hadn't seen was where it went after that. On the 4th day, a volunteer team found something in a shallow creek. One of her gloves, the Velcro strap, still cinched tight at the wrist. No tearing. No blood. It looked almost placed there. By the end of the week, most of the volunteers had gone home. Even the deputies stopped combing the woods and went back to their usual work: traffic stops, domestic disputes, paperwork. Alex kept walking the same loops, convinced he'd missed something. It was during one of those solitary searches that he found the drop camera. Not the GoPro that had been mounted on her helmet, that was still missing, but a small consumer drone half buried in silt at the edge of the river. It wasn't theirs. None of the instructors owned one. The casing was cracked, and the lens was fogged with condensation, but the battery was still intact. He didn't tell anyone about it. Instead, he carried it home in his backpack and left it on his kitchen table for a full day before touching it again. That night, under a single lamp, he pried the casing open, slid out the SD card, and slotted it into his laptop. The files were corrupted, but not beyond repair. Grainy video populated his screen, mostly empty sky with occasional jerks of the horizon. The date stamp matched the day she'd disappeared. For a long time, nothing happened. Just sky. Then, a shift. The lens tracked downward, catching the arc of parachutes in the distance. Alex could make out hers instantly, the red and white canopy, slightly offset from the others. But the camera didn't follow her descent to the ground. Instead, it tilted further, catching the edge of a clearing. And there, half hidden in the shadows at the tree line, were 3 figures. They didn't move like spectators. They didn't wave. They just stood there, still, as her canopy approached the gap in the forest. The video ended in a burst of static. Alex sat back, pulse hammering in his ears. If this was real, it meant someone else had been watching that jump, someone close enough to meet her where she landed. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blurred shapes in the trees waiting. The helicopter still floated in place above the open fields, its rotors chopping the air in long, mechanical heartbeats. The sky was a pale, winter-washed blue, the kind that looks almost thin, as though it could split open if you stared too long. Below, a neat grid of farmland stretched out in every direction, with roads like pencil lines and the occasional house tucked at a corner. From the ground, the jump had looked clean, at least at first. Witnesses said she had stepped to the edge without hesitation, her knees bent slightly against the wind's push, one gloved hand gripping the harness line, as though it were part of her own body. The instructor had been beside her, a short exchange barely visible in the video, his head leaning toward hers, her hair tugged sideways by the slipstream. Then she bent her knees deeper, pushed forward, and vanished into the sky. From the moment she left the aircraft, every camera followed her. The videos, half a dozen from different vantage points, captured her arching into the fall, her limbs stabilizing against the drag, a textbook descent posture. The instructor jumped seconds later, his trajectory offset to the right. That much was normal. Tandem formations weren't part of the plan. She was experienced enough to do the dive solo, and he was only there as a precaution. The first 30 seconds were perfect. Smooth, stable. At times, she tilted slightly, adjusting course. In two of the recordings, you could see her turn her head upward for a moment, perhaps to check the instructor's position. But then, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flailing, no sudden roll. Instead, her fall began to drift off the expected line, not wildly, but enough that the horizon behind her crept into frame at an odd angle. The instructor seemed to notice. He flattened his fall, gaining speed, closing distance. Then she was gone. Every witness swore differently on the exact instant. Some said she disappeared into a low bank of haze drifting in from the west. Others insisted there was no haze at all, only clear sky and distant ground. One man, who had been watching through binoculars, claimed she simply winked out, the way a light dies when the filament snaps. The instructor landed in the target field less than 2 minutes later, rolling to a stop in the crisp grass. He tore off his goggles and spun in a slow circle, scanning the sky. People thought he was joking at first. The scheduled jumps often included rehearsed scenarios, missed landings, unexpected drop zones. But his voice cut across the wind with an edge that left no doubt. "She didn't pull," he shouted. "I don't see her shoot." The drop zone crew froze. It was impossible not to pull. Even if a skydiver blacked out, the reserve chute's automatic activation device would deploy. But the sky overhead was empty. By the time search vehicles rolled toward the surrounding fields, the helicopter had already banked hard, beginning a wide, methodical sweep. The instructor was in the passenger seat of a pickup, his eyes locked on the horizon, jaw tight. The first hour turned up nothing. No fabric, no gear, no trace of a fall. The land here was open, a patchwork of hayfields and winter wheat, stitched together by irrigation ditches. Even a glove or helmet would stand out against the pale soil. By the second hour, the mood changed. Volunteers who had arrived in jeans and windbreakers now stood in small, silent clusters, watching the sky as though hoping she might still appear. Farmers in battered trucks parked along the dirt roads, leaving engines idling. Somewhere, a siren wailed, a sound that seemed wrong in the wide emptiness. The instructor stayed with the searches until dusk, answering the same questions again and again. His responses grew shorter each time. Yes, she was experienced. Yes, she had done solo dives before. Yes, all her equipment was checked before the jump. No, there was nothing unusual in her behavior. When pressed, he mentioned one detail he'd held back. Just before she began to drift, she'd raised her left hand slightly, palm outward, almost as if signaling to someone. "To who?" one of the deputies asked. "I don't know," he said, his voice flat. "We were the only two up there." The helicopter returned empty. The light drained from the fields. The search would continue in the morning, but already the talk among the crew had taken on a tone no one wanted to name. Skydivers didn't vanish. Not in open daylight. Not with cameras on them. That night, the drop zone hangar stayed lit long after the last vehicle left. Inside, two deputies replayed the jump footage on a laptop. Each time they paused, they leaned closer, pointing at the small figure in the freefall frame. She was steady, balanced, and then, in the space of a single frame, gone. No blur. No sudden change in light. Just sky where she had been. The sheriff's office had already taken statements from everyone who'd been at the airfield that day, but Abby felt like their questions skimmed over what mattered. She'd heard them talking in low voices outside the hangar, using words like equipment malfunction and freak accident, but she knew in her bones that Claire hadn't simply drifted away into thin air. By the third morning, Abby found herself back at the airfield before sunrise. The place was locked up, the hangar door chained, but there was a dirt access road around the back that led to the far end of the runway. The fog was moving low over the grass, curling around her legs as she walked. She kept expecting to hear the thump of rotor blades, that deep bass rumble that had marked the start of every jump. Instead, there was only the groan of the wind in the metal siding. She found the patch of grass where she'd been standing when Claire's parachute failed to appear. Someone had left a faint indentation in the earth, like a mark from a tripod leg or surveyor's pole. Abby crouched, touching it, trying to picture the moment. She'd seen the other jumpers arc down in wide, spiraling lines, parachutes flaring in bursts of color. She remembered holding her breath for the white canopy that never came. A movement caught her eye, out past the fence in the field beyond. At first, she thought it was a deer, but then she saw the flicker of fabric, blue nylon, tangled in the upper branches of a dying cottonwood tree. She scrambled toward the fence line, slipping in the wet grass. It wasn't a parachute, just a torn tarp caught in the wind, but for a heartbeat her chest had clenched so tightly she couldn't breathe. She stayed there for a long while, watching the tarp twist and snap in the breeze. When she finally turned back toward the runway, a figure was standing at the far edge, too far to make out their face. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still, hands in their pockets. She thought about calling out, but before she could, the fog thickened and the figure was gone. That afternoon, Abby went to see Mike Reynolds, one of the other jumpers. His small house sat at the edge of a mobile home park, the porch sagging under the weight of two old coolers and a sun-bleached patio chair. Mike looked surprised to see her, but waved her inside, offering coffee from a pot that had probably been sitting since morning. "I already told the sheriff everything I know," he said, leaning against the counter. Abby studied him. "Then tell me again. From the second you got into the plane." He ran a hand through his hair, sighed, and started talking. The story was almost exactly what she'd heard before: takeoff, climb to altitude, the green light, the rush of wind. But when he got to the part about the jump, he hesitated. "What?" she asked. Mike shook his head. "It's nothing. Just, when Claire went out, I swear I saw something drop from her harness. Not her chute, something smaller, like a pouch. It tumbled fast. I thought it might have just been one of those altimeter wrist things." Abby leaned forward. "And where did it fall?" "Hard to say. We were over the West Ridge. Dense trees. You wouldn't find it without a search team." She left with the location burned into her mind. That night, Abby couldn't sleep. The idea of something falling from Claire's harness gnawed at her. By dawn, she was on the ridge, hiking through undergrowth that tore at her jeans. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. Every so often, she'd stop and listen to the groan of branches, the drip of water from last night's rain. She found the spot almost by accident. A shallow depression where the leaves had been disturbed, as if something had fallen with force. In the center was a scrap of black nylon, no bigger than her palm, its edges frayed. She turned it over and felt the faint outline of stitching. It wasn't part of a parachute, and it hadn't been out here long. The fabric was clean, untouched by weather. She slipped it into her jacket pocket and kept moving, half expecting to find the rest of it nearby. But as she picked her way deeper into the trees, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. That was when she noticed something else. A smell, faint but sharp, metallic and unfamiliar. She followed it until the ground dipped sharply, revealing a narrow gully. At the bottom was a pool of water, dark and still. Something pale rested just below the surface. Abby crouched at the edge, reaching with a stick to disturb the water. The pale shape shifted, rolled, and for an instant she saw the unmistakable curve of human knuckles before the current took it deeper into the shadows. Her stomach lurched. She backed away, heart pounding, scanning the trees. The stillness pressed in from all sides. She forced herself to mark the location with a strip of cloth from her shirt, tying it to a branch before retreating the way she'd come. By the time she reached her car, the sun was high, burning the fog away. But that smell clung to her clothes, to her hair, a reminder she couldn't shake. That evening, she sat in her apartment, the scrap of black nylon on the table in front of her. She kept thinking about the pool in the gully, the pale shape beneath the water. She should call the sheriff, tell them everything. But she knew what would happen. Another search that came up empty, another official statement blaming wind patterns or faulty gear. Instead, she opened Claire's old laptop, which she'd taken from her sister's apartment before the landlord could clear it out. The desktop was neat, almost obsessively organized. There was a folder marked Jumps. Inside were videos, not of skydives, but of training sessions, notes on safety drills, and one file with a date just a week before Claire's disappearance. Abby clicked it open. The screen showed Claire, sitting cross-legged on her couch, hair pulled back, looking straight into the camera. "If you're seeing this, something went wrong," her voice said, steady but low. "It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't the weather. Check the ridge. You'll find what they didn't want you to see." The video ended abruptly. Abby sat frozen, the glow of the screen on her face. She reached out, rewound it, watched it again. Each time, the same calm warning. "Check the ridge." She looked at the scrap of nylon, then at the map spread on her table. The ridge stretched for miles. Whatever Claire had left out there, Abby was certain it wasn't just a pouch or a piece of equipment. And if Claire had known she might vanish, that meant someone else had known too. The day after the official search was scaled down, the sky above the drop zone felt unnaturally open. Planes still went up. Students still screamed into the wind. But there was a hollow quality to it now, like the sky itself had been gutted. Emma's mother, Carla, stayed in the area. She rented a small room above a cafe in town and spent her mornings at the edge of the airfield, staring at the horizon, as if Emma might come drifting down from it, late but unharmed. The instructors and jumpers avoided meeting her eyes. There was guilt in the way they moved around her, an awareness that whatever explanation existed had slipped beyond the reach of their sport's usual risks. Jason, the drop zone's most senior tandem instructor, came to see her on the third morning. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, one of them clutched awkwardly like it didn't belong in his hand. He sat beside her in the metal bleachers. "They looked through the bean field again," he said quietly. "And the creek beds." "Nothing." Carla didn't answer. "She was in the harness when you exited the plane," she said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "And when you pulled the chute?" Jason's jaw tightened. "She was." Carla's eyes didn't leave his face. "So, where is she?" The question was impossible, and yet she asked it again and again in different ways, each time with the calm persistence of someone who had decided that rage was useless. Jason could only shake his head. By the 5th day, the official logs from the jump were released to her. They showed everything: wind speeds, altitudes, equipment checks, radio communications. But somewhere in the sterile black text, the gap yawned open again, between 2 time stamps, between one radio call and the next. 1 second, the plane was climbing and Emma was on board. The next, the chute was deploying, with only Jason beneath it. At night, in her rented room, Carla played the helmet camera footage over and over. It showed the inside of the plane, the brief moments before exit. Emma was smiling tightly, her hair whipping in the prop wash. Jason was making some last-second adjustment to her goggles. The camera shifted toward the open door, and the world became a roar. Then static. The image broke apart into noise for less than a second, and when it cleared, Jason was falling alone. She froze the frame again and again, looking for the instant Emma slipped away. But there was no moment, only the before and the after. On the sixth night, Carla took the footage to a retired FAA investigator she found living 3 towns over. His name was Russell Kane. His home smelled faintly of aviation fuel and old paperwork. He watched the footage 3 times without speaking. Then he leaned back and rubbed his temples. "You ever heard of a partial sync loss?" he asked. "No, it's rare. Sometimes the audio and video streams from a GoPro will misalign for a fraction of a second. It can be caused by a power fluctuation or a shock to the camera. But here," he tapped the screen, "this isn't just a desync. It's a total data skip. Something happened to the signal." "What kind of something?" He didn't answer. Instead, he rewound and played the few frames before the static. Emma's face filled the frame again, and just at the edge of the image, over Jason's shoulder, something pale flickered. Not a face, something more like fabric, or a curved wingtip, vanishing upward instead of down. Russell paused it there. "That's strange." Carla leaned in. The shape was blurred, half swallowed by the chaos of wind and propeller wash. It could have been nothing, but it had the wrong direction, wrong motion entirely. The next morning, she took the frame to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty looked at it for less than a second before sliding it back across the desk. "We're not chasing ghosts," he said flatly. That night, back in her room, Carla dreamed of the sky over the drop zone. But it wasn't blue. It was heavy and white, like a ceiling you could press your palm against. And somewhere above it, Emma was knocking, softly, steadily, as though she'd been waiting the whole time. The news crews had left by the end of summer, but the people who came uninvited still found their way to the drop zone. Some drove in from the city and parked on the road, pretending to be there for the diner or the antique shop across the street, until someone noticed the cameras they kept half hidden on their laps. Others came on foot, circling the chain-link fence and peering in through the warped metal like they expected to see her waiting there, sitting on the picnic table where she used to lace her boots, laughing with someone over coffee, or stepping out of the shade with her parachute slung over her shoulder. They never saw that. By September, the airstrip's grass had grown high enough to bend in the wind like water. A few volunteers still came by on weekends to cut it back, but fewer each month. The hangar was locked now. The office phone rang only for wrong numbers or the occasional stranger asking if this was the place where the girl disappeared. The sheriff's department said the case was still open, but the man assigned to it was also responsible for livestock thefts and meth labs, and he didn't call much anymore. There had been no sightings, no unusual bank withdrawals, no phone pings. She was simply gone, as if she had fallen into the sky instead of from it. That fall, her mother began leaving messages on the voicemail again, just a few words each time, like she was talking to someone who might still be listening. Sometimes she read from a page. Sometimes she just said her daughter's name and hung up. The instructor who had jumped with her that day didn't return calls at all. He had left for Florida in October, telling a mutual friend it was just for the season, but no one expected him back. People whispered about him, about how calm he had seemed when he landed without her, about the way he had walked across the field without looking up at the open sky. The official report said he had been cooperative, but the field notes from the first responders told a different story. Did not approach search area, seemed reluctant to answer timeline questions, avoided eye contact when asked about equipment check. By winter, the drop zone was closed completely. The snow covered the runway and softened the sharp edges of the hangar's doors, and the only tracks across the field belonged to deer. Then, in February, a hunter reported something strange in the woods 3 miles north, a swath of treetops bent or broken, as though something heavy had come down through them months before. He'd found a section of torn canopy tangled high in a pine, stiff with frost, the lines hanging like dead vines. It wasn't hers. The serial number traced back to a rental rig from another state, one that had been reported missing 3 years earlier after a fatal accident in Nebraska. The sheriff's office told the family it was unrelated and just a coincidence. Her mother didn't believe that. She started driving the back roads at night, parking near fence lines where the moon lit the snow in patches, and walking out to where the drifts were still untouched. She said she could see boot prints sometimes, too fresh for the hour, too far from any road to make sense. She followed them until they vanished in the powder, always at a place where the trees leaned inward as if pulled by a weight above them. In March, she found something else. It was a glove, buried to the wrist in frozen mud near a stand of cedars. Not her daughter's, but small enough to have been hers. Inside, the lining was damp and smelled faintly of smoke. The sheriff took it for testing. No one called her back. By April, rumors had started again that someone had seen a woman walking along the access road near the water tower late at night, her hair wet, her clothes stained with something darker than mud, that she had turned when headlights passed, and for a moment her face had been pale enough to look like bone. Her mother began answering the phone on the first ring, but each time the line was dead, with only the faint hiss of wind in the receiver. The kind of sound you might hear if you held the phone out over an open sky. The helicopters returned before dawn. From her kitchen window, Meredith could see their lights hanging low over the desert, bright enough to turn the mesquite and cholla into shifting silhouettes. Every so often one of the beams would rake across the yard, flashing over the chain-link fence and catching the rim of her coffee cup in a pale glint. She had slept barely an hour. The night had been full of the sound of tires on gravel, search trucks, sheriff's SUVs, and volunteer off-roaders heading out to the flats. No one came to her door, but she could feel them moving around her, the entire county tightening into a single unspoken effort. Somewhere out there, beyond the last washed-out road, Rachel's parachute lay tangled and silent. By mid-morning, the official story had already frayed. In town, people spoke of equipment failures, bad luck with wind shear, or sudden health problems. But there were other accounts, passed quietly, as if sharing them too loudly might give them permanence. A ranch hand swore he saw Rachel land cleanly just before sundown, then turn and walk toward the dunes, trailing her chute like a veil. An ATV rider claimed he found drag marks on a dry lake bed, as though something or someone had been hauled away. Meredith heard all of it in fragments. She would catch a few words at the feed store, or on the corner by the post office. Then the conversation would falter when people noticed her standing there. The caution was not unkind. It was the caution of people who believed there were pieces of this they weren't supposed to know. 2 days later, she was called out to the temporary command tent they had set up near the drop zone. The air inside was stale with the smell of sun-baked nylon and instant coffee. A map of the surrounding area had been stretched across a folding table, covered in overlapping arcs drawn in red marker. An older man in a khaki sheriff's vest pointed to the far edge of the largest circle. "We think she came down somewhere in here, but the wind readings don't line up." And he hesitated. "And we've got conflicting data from the altimeter logs." Meredith frowned. "Conflicting how?" "Her device says she was still at 2,000 feet when the instructor's canopy deployed. But that's impossible if the spotters on the ground saw 2 canopies open at the same time." The man glanced at another deputy, as though deciding how much more to share. Finally, he slid a clear evidence bag across the table. Inside was a small, black piece of webbing, the cut end frayed and stiff with heat. "We found this about 300 yards from the drop zone boundary. Looks like it was severed clean." Meredith stared at it for a long moment, her pulse thudding in her ears. Skydiving lines could snap in rare cases, old equipment, unseen nicks from transport. But a cut was something else entirely. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with Rachel's old laptop open in front of her. It was one of the few things the sheriff's office had returned right away. The desktop background was still the same photograph Rachel had taken the summer before, a dirt road fading into an orange horizon, tire tracks glittering with heat. Meredith clicked through folders without thinking, more out of a need to hear the quiet hum of the machine than any real hope of finding something. Near midnight, she opened a folder named Rut South. Inside were dozens of video clips, most only a few seconds long. They appeared to have been filmed during flights, wind roaring in the mic, the desert scrolling by far below. But some were stranger. One showed nothing but an empty stretch of salt flat filmed from a distance. Another was of a cluster of silver trailers parked in a loose ring, their roofs flashing in the sun. In the background, almost inaudible under the wind, was a voice, low, hurried, speaking words Meredith couldn't quite make out. She played it again, this time with headphones. The voice came clearer now. 2 minutes passed. Keep them inside until... The rest was swallowed by static. Meredith sat back, her skin prickling. It wasn't the words themselves. They could have been anything. It was the way Rachel's breathing had changed just before the clip cut off. Quick, shallow, like she'd been trying not to be heard. She shut the laptop and turned off the light. But sleep didn't come. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose tin on the shed roof. In the dark, it sounded almost like parachute fabric snapping overhead. She lay there, listening, trying to tell herself it was only the weather. By morning, the helicopters were gone. The search parties had pulled back to a skeleton crew. Officially, they were shifting to investigative leads. Unofficially, Meredith knew they had reached the point where every mile walked was more for the living than the missing. And yet, that afternoon, a package appeared on her porch. No postage, no return address, just her name written in thin, hesitant letters. Inside was a small, handheld GPS unit. Its screen was dark, battery long dead. Taped to the back was a strip of paper with a single set of coordinates written in the same handwriting. The location was far out, well past the last grid square the search teams had swept. A place where the desert floor turned pale and cracked, and the heat shimmered so hard the horizon vanished. Meredith set the GPS down, her hand trembling. If she went, she knew she would be alone. And if Rachel had walked that way after she landed, then whatever had taken her wasn't finished yet. The wind had been strange that week, not a roaring wind, but a steady, ceaseless drift, like the air itself was moving somewhere with purpose. Liam noticed it on his drives to the drop zone. The grass along the highway seemed to lean in one direction, no matter which way he turned. He didn't mention it to anyone. It sounded like the kind of thing people heard and decided you'd been spending too much time alone. By Thursday, he had run out of new places to search. He'd traced the river downstream from the ranch, walked the scrub fields at dawn, even driven aimlessly for hours in widening circles until he found himself 50 miles from the original search grid. The sheriff's office was polite but tired. "We can't reopen it every time you get a feeling," one deputy said, though Liam noticed the way the man's eyes lingered on him, the way people look when they want to say they don't believe you, but something makes them hesitate. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. The old footage had been looping in his head for days. The training video, the woman laughing in the wind, the brief clip of her walking across the tarmac before that last jump. He watched it again, this time slowing it frame by frame. It wasn't what she was doing that caught him. It was what was happening behind her. On the far left of the frame, almost blurred out, a dark figure stood near the hangar doors. Not moving, not watching her, just there. Liam rewound it, played it again. Same figure, same stillness. He checked the date on the footage. It was from 2 weeks before her disappearance. 2 weeks. Meaning, if it was someone connected, they had been there long before anyone thought something was wrong. By morning, he had driven back to the hangar. The sky was white and low, as if the horizon had folded in on itself. The hangar was empty except for the faint smell of fuel and the echo of his own footsteps. He stood where the figure would have been in the footage. The view from that corner was odd. You could see the tarmac clearly, but also the back service road and a sliver of the airfield's fence line. That fence line had a gate, and beyond it, a narrow dirt path running toward the tree line. He walked the path. It didn't feel like it had been used often, but there were faint depressions in the soil, not enough to call footprints, but enough to know it had been walked. At the tree line, the path split in two, one arm leading deeper into the pines, the other cutting toward a low ridge. The ridge drew him in. From the top, you could see the river, and, further still, the isolated plateau where the parachutes sometimes drifted if the wind changed at altitude. It was the kind of place you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it. At the base of the ridge, half hidden by weeds, was something metal. Liam knelt. It was a buckle, the quick-release kind used on skydiving harnesses. The surface was scraped, the edges dented. He held it in his hand for a long time before slipping it into his jacket. That night, he didn't tell anyone. Not the sheriff, not the other instructors, not even her sister when she called. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with the buckle in front of him and the footage on his laptop. There was a rhythm to it now, the way small things lined up. The wind leaning one way, the figure by the hangar, the dirt path, and in the middle of it all, her voice from the old recordings, the casual way she had said, "It's like the air knows where it wants to take you." He thought about that as the clock pushed past midnight. Somewhere out there, the air had taken her, and maybe it wasn't done. The next morning, he went back to the ridge. This time, he brought water and a flashlight. He followed the second branch of the path, the one that disappeared into the pines. It twisted more than it should have, doubling back on itself like it was meant to disorient. At one point, he almost turned back, convinced he was walking in circles. Then the trees opened, revealing a clearing he hadn't seen before. At its center was a dug pit, no wider than a doorframe. The soil around it recently turned. The bottom wasn't visible, just darkness. Nearby, scattered in the grass, were strips of colored nylon. He knew instantly what they were. Canopy fabric, the kind used in parachutes. Some were shredded. Others looked burned at the edges. Liam crouched, fingers grazing the fabric. A few strands came away in his hand, and he realized there was more, small threads tangled in the weeds, leading toward the pit like something had been dragged. He didn't go closer. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back, scanning the tree line. The stillness was too complete. Even the steady wind he'd felt for days was absent here, as if the clearing was sealed off from the rest of the world. And then he saw it, not movement, but the faintest impression of someone having stood at the far edge of the clearing, watching. The weeks following the helicopter sweep of the canyon settled into a strange half-life. News crews came and went. Volunteers trickled home. The search grid on the command tent map stayed the same, red tape marking the ravine, the forest edge, the dry creek bed, but the people staring at it changed daily. Some days it was seasoned search and rescue veterans. Other days it was just Marla, sitting in a folding chair, rubbing her hands together, and muttering the same question under her breath. Where would she go? By the 9th week, the investigation shifted in tone. Instead of combing the cliff base with lines of people, deputies worked in small, quiet teams, often without telling reporters. They began going door to door at skydiving hangars and ultralight clubs across 3 counties. They asked about anyone, pilots, instructors, even visiting tourists, who might have left abruptly after the jump. That was when they found the couple. They lived in a small rental outside Elsinore. The man, tanned and wiry, claimed he'd been a jump spotter for a few years. His girlfriend worked the gear shack. Neither name matched anyone from the manifest on the day the woman vanished. At first glance, they seemed peripheral, just another skydiving-adjacent pair in a town full of them. But an old GoPro clip found in the man's storage locker showed something odd. A view of the ravine from above, recorded weeks before the missing jump. He claimed it was just scenery footage. The deputy who reviewed it said the camera lingered too long on one particular clearing, almost as if someone had marked it. When Marla was told about this, she didn't react. She just kept her eyes fixed on the deputy's mouth as though memorizing the shape of each word. She didn't ask who the couple was or why they'd been taking aerial footage there. Instead, she stood, left the tent, and walked the long path to her car without saying goodbye. Later, in the unlit interior of her sedan, she sat for 2 hours listening to a voicemail from her daughter. Not one from that morning or the week before, but from 2 months prior, the night before the jump. It was a short message, mostly laughter, muffled wind noise, and the words, "I think I finally get it." Marla replayed it until the battery light flashed. Meanwhile, one of the canine teams made an unexpected discovery. Not the woman, not clothing, but a small, waterproof case wedged into the fork of a cottonwood tree about a mile from the jump zone. It contained a compact satellite tracker. The device was registered to a private skydiving club that had dissolved years earlier. Its last recorded ping was from the morning of the woman's final jump, and the coordinates didn't match the drop zone. The sheriff's department didn't release this detail publicly, but word spread anyway. By the following week, several volunteer divers returned to search the deeper bends of the river that wound through the canyon. They found nothing. No gear, no helmet, no chute. Just silt and cold green water that moved slower than it looked. On the 89th day after the disappearance, a hunter in the foothills came across something he thought was trash. A torn scrap of nylon tangled in thorn bush. The color was faded, but the weave matched parachute material. Testing confirmed it had been exposed to weather for months. There were no rips suggesting a violent landing, just frayed edges, as if it had been cut deliberately. Marla wasn't told about this right away. She learned when she overheard two SAR members whispering near the supply truck. She didn't confront them. She didn't ask for the piece. She only turned away and began walking toward the canyon rim, where the wind carried the faint, tinny sound of laughter from somewhere far below, though there was no one visible on the trails. By now, every theory had been exhausted. Every lead spiraled into the same blunt wall. She went out of the plane, and she never came down where she should have. The rest was silence, scattered artifacts, and the echo of her voice on that old voicemail, always ending the same way, half laughing, almost out of breath. "I think I finally get it." The water lay still under a washed-out sky, the lake a sheet of pale glass that reflected clouds without giving away anything beneath. From the shore, the dive crew's pontoon boat floated without a ripple, anchored above a spot they had marked 2 days earlier. The coordinates had been drawn from weeks of combing sonar images, from hours of arguments between specialists who couldn't agree on the shape they saw in the shadows. It took almost an hour for the divers to surface again. They rose slowly, as if reluctant to leave whatever they had found below. Their voices carried over the water, but didn't travel far. Low tones, careful movements, gear clinking against the ladder as they hauled themselves back aboard. On the dock, Megan's mother didn't move. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her chin tucked slightly down, watching every detail without asking. When one of the deputies jogged over, she only turned her head slightly, waiting for him to speak. "They want you to know. It's hers," he said, eyes darting to the water. "But they're still bringing it up." The lift took hours. First came pieces of twisted harness webbing, frayed to the point that one diver carried it in a mesh bag, as though it might fall apart if the wind hit wrong. Then a torn sleeve of bright nylon, once vibrant, now bleached to a shade between gray and bone. The reserve chute lines were snarled in something hard, barnacled over, that turned out to be part of the jump frame from the plane's open door. But it was the helmet that made everyone go quiet. The plexiglass was cracked, the edge warped from impact, but inside, nestled like something placed there, was her altimeter watch, still strapped around the padded chin lining. The hands were frozen at 0:12. By the time the coroner's team arrived, the sun was slipping behind the ridge. The lake darkened to the color of wet slate, and the last of the divers' bubbles had stopped surfacing. One of them climbed back onto the dock, peeling off gloves, and said softly, "We found her. They didn't bring her to shore until well after dark." The lights from the dock made the water glitter in a way that felt almost wrong, too clean, too sharp against what was being pulled from it. The body bag was heavy, not from her weight, but from the years she had spent down there, sealed in layers of silt. No one spoke her name until she was on land. Later, in the sheriff's office, a deputy slid an envelope across the desk toward Megan's mother. Inside were photographs, a wrist compass with a casing still intact, a thin chain with a small silver feather pendant, and a strip of waterlogged film, the images too clouded to see clearly. One frame, when held to the light, showed only a sliver of blue sky and a hint of another parachute far below her. There had been no other scheduled jumpers that day. The official report would call it an uncontrolled descent following equipment failure, but there were gaps the paper couldn't fill, like why her reserve chute had been manually cut away, or why the final GPS ping from her altimeter didn't match the coordinates of the recovery site, and why, after all these years, the plane's jump frame was still tangled in her lines, as though it had gone down with her. A month after the recovery, Megan's mother drove out to the ridge overlooking the lake. The leaves had turned brittle and gold, breaking loose in the wind, scattering over the water below. She brought nothing with her, no flowers, no markers. Just a small tin of the earth from their backyard garden, the same place her daughter had sat cross-legged one summer, planting marigolds in silence. She tipped the soil into the wind, watching it drift toward the water. That night, long after she had returned home, she stood in the kitchen and stared out through the sliding glass door. Far off, beyond the streetlights, she thought she saw the flash of a strobe, the kind skydivers wear on night jumps. Just one pulse, then another, then nothing. It could have been a trick of the reflection. It could have been someone else's lights. It could have been